My mother-in-law smiled at me from across the conference room table like she was doing me a favor by being there. That smile. I had seen it 100 times. At Sunday dinners when she'd compliment my cooking with just enough of a pause before the word interesting. At my wedding, when she hugged me and whispered into my ear, "You're going to need to work very hard to keep up with this family." At the hospital 3 days after I lost the baby, when she patted my hand and said, "These things happen for a reason, sweetheart." Maybe it just wasn't the right time. I had spent 4 years learning to swallow that smile, to breathe through it, to smile back. But that afternoon, sitting across from her in a beige conference room on the 14th floor of a law firm I had no business being in, I didn't smile back. I looked down at the folder in front of me. I straightened the edge of the papers against the table, and I waited. She didn't know what was in that folder. None of them did. That was the only advantage I had, and I had protected it like my life depended on it. I need to back up. My name is not important. What is important is that I was 26 years old when I married into a family that had more money than sense and more pride than either. My husband, I'll call him my ex-husband now because that's what he is. His name was Sutton, old family name. His mother's maiden name, actually, which should have told me something from the beginning about how things worked in that household. Sutton was charming when I met him. He was the kind of man who made you feel like the only person in the room, which I later understood was a skill he had developed precisely because it worked. I was a 23-year-old nurse working double shifts at a hospital in Raleigh. He was in town for a medical equipment conference. We met at a bar on a Tuesday night. He was funny and warm, and he listened to me talk about my job for 2 hours without once checking his phone. I should have checked his phone. I won't spend too long on the marriage itself because this story isn't really about Sutton. Sutton was weak in the specific way that only men raised entirely by their mother's expectations can be. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't a monster. He was just permanently 11 years old inside, always looking sideways to see if his mother approved. Every major decision in our marriage, where we lived, what we did on holidays, whether we bought a house or kept renting, whether I went back to school for my nurse practitioner degree, every single one was filtered through her. Her name was Marguerite, and she hated me. Not in a dramatic, obvious way. In the patient architectural way that some women hate their daughters-in-law. Brick by brick, year by year. She never raised her voice at me. She never said anything that could be directly quoted as cruel. But she built a structure around our marriage with such quiet precision that by the time I saw it clearly, I was already mostly walled in. She had 3 primary tools: money, time, and information. The money was her most powerful one. Sutton had a good salary as a regional director for a medical device company, but his real financial security, the house, the investment accounts, the safety net he could never quite articulate but always referenced, came from his family. His grandmother had left a trust. Marguerite controlled access to it. This was never stated directly, it was just known. The time was subtler. Every holiday was at her house 2 hours away in Greensboro. Every family event required Sutton's attendance, and his attendance required mine, and my absence was always noted and later referenced. "We missed you at Easter. It was strange not having you there for Dad's birthday." My own family, my mom in Asheville, my younger sister, my aunt who raised me for 2 years when things were hard, they became peripheral, secondary. They were never invited. They were never even mentioned by Marguerite, unless it was to observe gently that it must be hard for Sutton not to have more of a family support system on my side. The information was the most dangerous one. What I mean is, Marguerite always knew things before I did. When Sutton was passed over for a promotion, when there was a problem with his car, when he was stressed about something at work, she knew because he told her. First, before he told me. There was a version of our marriage that existed between them in texts and phone calls I wasn't part of, and I was always one step behind in that version. I am telling you all of this because it matters for what came later, because what happened in that conference room didn't come from nowhere. It came from 4 years of careful observation. The marriage ended the way those marriages usually end. Not with a fight, but with a revelation. I came home from a 12-hour shift on a Thursday night to find Sutton sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a look on his face that I recognized immediately as rehearsed. He had practiced what he was about to say. He had probably practiced it with his mother. He said he thought we had grown apart. He said he didn't feel like we wanted the same things anymore. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking and talking to some people who knew him well, and he felt like this was the right decision for both of us. I asked him if he had talked to Marguerite before talking to me. He said that wasn't the point. I sat down across from him and I asked him, very calmly, to tell me about the house. The house was the issue. We had bought it 3 years earlier, and the down payment had come from my savings. $62,000 I had put away over 7 years of nursing, working nights, skipping vacations, moving into a smaller apartment when I could, not buying things I wanted. The mortgage was in both our names. But the down payment was mine, every cent of it. Sutton knew this. We had never formalized it in writing because we were married and I was 25, and it didn't occur to me that I needed to protect myself inside my own marriage. That is a thing I will spend a long time being honest with myself about. He said his attorney had advised him that in North Carolina, marital property was subject to equitable distribution, and that the down payment source, while noted, did not automatically entitle me to a larger share of the equity. His attorney. He already had an attorney. I looked at him for a long moment, then I picked up my bag. I went to the bedroom, I packed enough for 3 days, and I drove to my mom's house in Asheville. I cried for most of the drive, but by the time I got there, something had shifted in me. Or maybe it hadn't shifted. Maybe it had just finally come fully into focus. I was done being one step behind. I need to be honest about the next part, because people sometimes hear this kind of story and imagine that I had some brilliant strategic mind operating the whole time. I didn't. I was scared and exhausted, and I missed my house, and I was angry in a way that had no clean edges. But I am also a person who, when overwhelmed, makes lists, so I made a list. I wrote down everything I knew, every account, every asset, every piece of property, every document I had ever seen or touched or signed. I wrote down the dates, I wrote down what I remembered about conversations. I wrote down the name of the trust which I had seen on a piece of paperwork once. When Marguerite had accidentally left something on the kitchen counter during a holiday visit, and I had, without planning to, read it in the 30 seconds before she came back into the room. I am not proud of every moment of this story, but I am honest about them. I used those 3 days at my mom's house well. I called a legal aid clinic in Asheville. I spoke to a paralegal named, well, she asked me not to use her name, so I'll just say she was patient with me and very good at her job. She walked me through what documentation I should try to gather. Bank records showing the source of the down payment, any written communication, emails, texts, where the $62,000 was acknowledged as mine. The mortgage documents, the closing disclosure. I had most of it. I had kept everything, not because I was strategic, because I am the kind of person who keeps everything, going back to an anxiety about losing important papers that I developed in childhood and never entirely outgrew. My filing cabinet was thorough in the way that only mildly anxious people's filing cabinets are thorough. I also, and this is the part I wasn't expecting to matter, went back through 4 years of texts and emails between me and Sutton, not looking for anything specific, just reading. And I found something. 18 months into our marriage, we had briefly discussed refinancing the house. During that conversation, conducted mostly over text, because Sutton traveled a lot for work, he had written, "Obviously the $62K you put in is yours, that was always understood. I'm just saying for the refinance paperwork it might be cleaner to structure it differently. Obviously, Lee, the $62K you put in is yours." I took a screenshot. I printed it. I put it in a folder. The mediation was Marguerite's idea. Sutton's attorney, a man named Philip who had the energy of someone who charged by the quarter hour and knew it, had proposed a settlement that was, to put it plainly, insulting. 50-50 on the house equity, no acknowledgement of the down payment, and a division of other marital assets that somehow ended up with Sutton keeping the newer car, and me keeping the older one, and a list of household items that felt like a yard sale organized by someone who didn't like me. Marguerite called me herself to suggest mediation. This was unusual. She said she thought it would be less adversarial. She said she wanted this to be handled with dignity. She said she hoped we could find a resolution that felt fair to everyone. I said that sounded fine. What I didn't say was that I had spent 3 weeks, by that point, working with a family law attorney in Raleigh. I had scraped together the retainer from my savings and a loan from my mom that I am still paying back, and that my attorney, a woman named Sylvie who had 20 years of family law experience and the affect of someone who had heard every version of every story and remained unimpressed, had looked at my documentation and said, "This is actually a pretty solid case." I also didn't say that I had, on the advice of a forensic accountant my attorney referred me to, spent 2 evenings tracing the publicly available financial structure of the family trust. Not anything private. Just what was registered, what was filed with the state, what could be found in property records and corporate filings. I am not a forensic accountant, but I am good at following instructions, and the instructions were clear. What I found was interesting. The trust had, at some point in the last 5 years, been restructured. There was a real estate asset, a vacation property in the Outer Banks that Marguerite had mentioned, offhandedly, several times over the years, that appeared in the original trust documentation but not in a more recent filing. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but my attorney did. She made a call. The mediation was held in the law firm's conference room on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The weather outside was the kind of clear, cold, aggressively beautiful North Carolina fall weather that makes you feel like the world is indifferent to your problems. Which, I suppose it is. Sutton arrived with Philip, who was carrying a leather portfolio and a coffee. Marguerite arrived with them, which was, as my attorney quietly noted, unusual. Mediating parties don't typically bring parents. Philip introduced her as a family stakeholder with relevant financial knowledge. The mediator, a calm woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, accepted this without comment. I arrived with Sylvie. Marguerite looked at me across the table with that smile. Patient. Architectural. "I'm glad we could do this," she said. "I think it's the right approach," I said. I agreed the first hour was what you would expect. Philip laid out their position. Sylvie laid out ours. Numbers were discussed. The down payment was raised. Philip said, with the practiced smoothness of someone who had said this many times, that while the source of the funds was noted, North Carolina equitable distribution law did not automatically guarantee a dollar-for-dollar return on premarital contributions in a marital property context. Sylvie said she understood that position. Then she placed a document on the table. It was the text message. Printed with the metadata visible, date, time, sender. Obviously the $62K you put in is yours. That was always understood. Philip looked at it. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. Sutton looked at the table. Marguerite's smile did not move, but it became a different kind of smile. The kind that is held in place by intention rather than feeling. Sylvie said, pleasantly, that she'd also like to raise a separate matter related to the family trust, and that she hoped Marguerite, given her presence as a stakeholder, might be able to help clarify a discrepancy in the asset filings. The room changed temperature. Philip said carefully that he wasn't sure what the trust had to do with the current proceedings. Sylvie said she wasn't sure either, but that the discrepancy was interesting and that it might be relevant to a full accounting of marital assets. Given that Sutton had, at various points during the marriage, received financial support from the trust that could be characterized as marital income. She wasn't threatening anything. She was asking a question, but the question was shaped like a key, and everyone in the room could see what door it might open. Marguerite said, for the first time since I had known her, nothing. Philip asked for a recess. We sat in a smaller room down the hall for 22 minutes. I know because I counted. Sylvie reviewed notes. I drank water and looked at the window and tried to breathe evenly. She looked at me at one point and said, "You're doing great." I said I didn't feel like I was doing anything. She said that was exactly right. You did everything already. Right now you just have to sit here. When we went back into the conference room, Philip's posture was different. Marguerite was on her phone, not looking up. Sutton was looking at the table in a way that reminded me of every family dinner where he had sat in exactly that position, waiting for his mother to tell him what to think. Philip said they were prepared to discuss a revised framework. The revised framework acknowledged the $62,000 down payment as my separate property contribution. It proposed a division of equity that reflected that contribution. It also quietly dropped several of the items from the proposed asset division that had been most unfavorable to me. It was not everything I wanted, but it was close. Sylvie looked at me. I looked at the folder still sitting closed in front of me. Then I nodded. We finalized the agreement 6 weeks later. I got back the equity that reflected my down payment. I got the car I wanted. I got the kitchen table that had been my grandmother's, which nobody had thought to argue about, but which mattered to me more than any of the other things. I did not get my marriage back. I did not get 4 years of Sunday dinners and holidays and learning to breathe through that smile. I did not get the version of my 30s I had imagined, but I got something I didn't know I had been missing. The week after everything was finalized, I drove to Asheville to see my mom. We sat on her back porch in the November cold and drank bad coffee, and I told her the whole thing from the beginning, which I had not done before because I hadn't wanted to worry her, and because some part of me had not wanted to say out loud how bad it had gotten. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which is not her natural tendency. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what your grandmother used to say." I shook my head. She used to say that the quietest person in the room is usually the one who's already made up their mind. I didn't say anything. I looked out at her yard, at the November bare oak tree and the bird feeder she'd had for 30 years and never quite remembers to fill. Marguerite sent me a text 3 months later. It was short. It said, "I hope you're doing well." I looked at it for a long time. Then I put my phone down and went back to studying for my nurse practitioner exam, which I had registered for 6 weeks after the mediation. On a Tuesday morning when I woke up early and felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was building something that was entirely mine. I passed it on the first try.